The night I quit my job as a security guard, I didn't write a letter. I just walked out of that building, got in my car, and drove until the sun came up, because I knew that if I stayed one more minute inside Hargrove Memorial, whatever was still living in Ward 7 would have found me. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that in the fall of 2019, I was 26 years old, broke, and desperate. I'd been sending out resumes for 3 months after getting laid off from my last warehouse job. So when a staffing agency called me about a night shift security position, $17.50 an hour, minimal experience required, I didn't ask a lot of questions. I should have asked more. Hargrove Memorial Hospital in Decatur, Illinois, had been closed since 2011. A combination of lawsuits, state funding cuts, and what the local paper vaguely called structural concerns had shuttered the place almost overnight. The plan, according to the property management company that hired me, was to eventually convert it into a mixed-use development. Until then, they needed someone on site overnight to deter vandals and make sure no pipes burst in the winter cold. Simple enough, right? My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. On my first night, my supervisor, a tired-looking man named Gerald who smelled like cigarettes and fast food, handed me a flashlight, a two-way radio, and a printed map of the building. He pointed to a section on the 3rd floor that was circled in red pen. Ward 7, he said. That whole wing is structurally compromised. You do not go in there. You don't need to check it. You don't investigate sounds coming from it. You just leave it alone. He looked at me a beat too long when he said that last part. I mean it. Leave it alone. I figured he was just covering liability. Hospitals are full of asbestos and rotting floors. I nodded, took the keys, and that was that. Gerald left me there before the door had even fully closed behind him. The building at night is a different kind of quiet, not peaceful quiet, waiting quiet. The first 2 weeks were uneventful. Hargrove was huge, 6 floors, 2 wings, over 300 rooms, and I spent my shifts doing slow loops through the corridors, checking doors, shining my flashlight into rooms that still had hospital beds in them, old IV poles, overturned wheelchairs, the kind of stuff that looks creepy on a ghost hunting show, but just feels sad when you're standing in it alone at 2 in the morning. The building made sounds. All old buildings do. Pipes groaned. Wind pushed through broken windows on the upper floors. Somewhere deep in the east wing, a loose metal door would occasionally bang against its frame. I learned all those sounds. I cataloged them. That's how I know that what I heard on the 15th night was different. It started just after midnight. I was on the 2nd floor, halfway through my route, when I heard it above me. A slow, rhythmic dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across a tile floor. One long drag, a pause, then again. I stood completely still and listened. The sound was coming from the 3rd floor, from the direction of Ward 7. I radioed it in. The overnight dispatcher, a bored woman named Sandra, told me it was probably a raccoon. Animals get into these old buildings all the time, she said. As long as nothing's on fire, just finish your rounds. I did, but I didn't sleep well that day. The next night, it happened again. Same time, same sound, that slow, deliberate drag across the floor above me. This time, I stood underneath it and tracked it. It moved in a straight line from one end of the Ward 7 corridor to the other, back and forth. Once, then silence. I told myself, raccoons, possums, something that got in through a broken window. On the third night, the sound stopped mid-drag right above my head, and then, very slowly, I heard footsteps. Small, careful, deliberate footsteps moving to the edge of the floor above me, right to where the air vent was. And then I heard breathing coming through the vent. Someone or something breathing down into the corridor where I was standing. I ran, not toward the exit, toward the stairwell. I don't know why. Adrenaline doesn't care about logic. I made it to the second floor landing, stopped, and forced myself to breathe. Nothing followed me. After a few minutes, the building went silent again. I told myself there was a rational explanation. I needed to believe that, because the alternative was something I wasn't ready to face. I started doing research. Hargrove Memorial had a long history and not a good one. In the 1980s, a patient in the psychiatric unit, which was on the third floor in what was now Ward 7, had been reported missing. His name was Raymond Cull, 43 years old, admitted for severe paranoid schizophrenia. One morning, he simply wasn't in his room. The staff assumed he'd walked out somehow. They filed a report. He was never found. There was something else. When the hospital closed in 2011, one of the maintenance workers told a local reporter that in his last week on the job, he kept finding things disturbed in the sealed wing. Food wrappers, a blanket, scratch marks on the inside of a supply closet door. The reporter's article called it likely evidence of squatters. The paper moved on. Nobody followed up. On the 18th night of my job, I found a handprint on the dust-covered window at the end of the second-floor hallway. Small, adult-sized but delicate, with long, thin fingers. It was on the inside of the glass, fresh. The dust around it was still settling when I found it. My throat went completely dry. I looked out the window. It faced the inner courtyard, 4 floors down, no ledges, no way up from outside. On the 21st night, I decided I was going into Ward 7. I know exactly what you're thinking, but you have to understand, I'd spent 3 weeks being slowly terrified by something I couldn't explain, and the part of me that needed an answer had finally overridden the part of me that was afraid. I told Sandra I was doing a routine check of the 3rd floor and that she didn't need to radio me for the next 30 minutes. She said fine. The door to Ward 7 was chained from the outside with a padlock, but the chain was loose enough that by sliding the door open about 10 inches, I could squeeze through. Someone had done exactly that. The dust on the floor was disturbed in a narrow line right where the door opened. Fresh disturbance, recent. I slipped inside. The ward was darker than the rest of the building. The windows at the far end had been covered from the inside with what looked like old hospital gowns, taped across the frames. My flashlight caught the walls, and I stopped walking. Every inch of the left wall for the entire length of the corridor, maybe 60 feet, was covered in writing. Not paint, not marker, something darker. It was written in small, cramped letters that spiraled in on themselves, lines crossing over lines until it was nearly unreadable. The few words I could make out near the edges, where it was less dense, were dates, hundreds of dates going back to the early 1980s, and names. I didn't recognize most of them, but near the center of the wall, repeated dozens of times in larger letters, were the words, "They keep coming back. I watch them. They don't see me." At the far end of the corridor, one of the patient room doors was open. I walked toward it. My hands were shaking so badly the flashlight beam was stuttering against the walls. Inside the room was a nest. There is no other word for it. A mattress had been dragged from somewhere and wedged into the corner. It was surrounded by stacked food containers, canned goods, some of them modern brands, which meant someone had been bringing in fresh supplies. There were water jugs, a small battery-powered lantern switched off, a stack of folded hospital blankets, and on the wall above the mattress, a single photograph. It was a Polaroid, faded with age. A man, gaunt and smiling, standing in what looked like a hospital hallway. On the back, written in that same cramped hand, Raymond. Home. That's when the lantern turned on. Not the flashlight, the lantern in the corner of the room. It clicked on by itself, filling the room with a dim yellow glow. And in that glow, I saw that the closet door, the one directly to my left, which I had not checked, was open, just barely, maybe 3 inches. And there was an eye looking at me through the gap. I did not scream. I couldn't. My entire body locked. The eye was pale, unblinking, and it was watching me with an expression I can only describe as curious. The way you'd look at an animal that had wandered into your kitchen. It didn't blink, it didn't move, it just watched me. Then, very softly, a voice came from behind the door, low, almost gentle. "You're not a patient." I ran. I dropped the flashlight. I hit the door frame so hard my shoulder went numb. I ran through the Ward 7 corridor, through the chain door, down 3 flights of stairs, and out the front entrance of Hargrove Memorial into the freezing November air. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I sat there for 2 hours with the doors locked and the engine running. I called the police from my car. They came. They went inside. 20 minutes later, an officer came out and told me that Ward 7 was empty. There was evidence of long-term habitation, the nest, the food supplies, the writing on the walls, but no person. The closet I'd described was empty. There was only one way in or out of that wing, and they had had officers at both the door and the exterior fire escape. Whoever, whatever had been inside had simply vanished, again, just like it had in 1987. I quit the next morning, never went back. But here's the part that keeps me up at night, the part I didn't find out until weeks later when I was reading through old local news archives from 2011. The article about the hospital closing. I almost missed it. It was a small detail buried near the end of a story about the property being sold. The property management company had hired one security guard before me, a 24-year-old from Springfield. He'd worked the night shift for 3 weeks, exactly as long as I had, and then stopped showing up. The company assumed he quit. They marked him as a no-call, no-show and moved on. His name was never published, just his age. His family filed a missing persons report 6 months later when they hadn't heard from him. As of the last update I could find, he was still listed as missing. I think about Raymond Cull, 40 years hiding in those walls, watching every person who came through, learning their routines, knowing when they'd be alone. And I think about what he said to me through that closet door. "You're not a patient." The thing that haunts me, the thing I can never unhear, is how disappointed he sounded when he said it. Like he'd been expecting someone else, like someone else was supposed to have walked through that door instead of me, like maybe someone already had.